personal strength, with an openness to possibilities that had not previously seemed real or available, and in many cases, with a more meaningful philosophical or spiritual relationship with existence itself, not in spite of having been broken, because of it. The critical distinction here matters far more than it first appears. Post-traumatic growth is not the same thing as feeling better over time. It is not gratitude practiced as a coping exercise, not a reframe adopted to manage the difficulty of grief, not the relief that arrives when the acute phase of a crisis finally subsides. Tedeschi and Calhoun were precise about this. The growth they were documenting emerged specifically from the dismantling of what they called assumptive worlds. The internal structures of belief, expectation, and personal narrative through which each person has always interpreted their life, understood who they are, and organized what they believe is possible. When those structures are sufficiently disrupted by a major life event, the person is forced into a form of cognitive and emotional reconstruction that can produce not only recovery, but a qualitatively different relationship with existence than the one they held before. The mechanism behind it is not comfortable. It begins with what Tedeschi and Calhoun described as seismic events, experiences so significant that they shake the foundational assumptions that had previously organized a person's entire sense of self and world. The sudden loss of someone central to their life. A medical diagnosis that reorders all priorities without asking permission. The collapse of a career, a marriage, or an identity that had been assumed stable. The event itself does not produce growth. What produces growth is the specific process that the event forces into motion. The person must engage in what researchers call deliberate rumination, effortful and intentional cognitive work on what happened, what it means, what it has changed, and what can be. Something happened to you. Maybe it was a loss that arrived without warning, in a moment so ordinary that you remember what you were doing when your phone rang. Maybe it was a relationship that ended in a way that still does not make complete sense when you try to reconstruct it. Maybe it was an illness, a failure that cost more than you had estimated, a door that closed on something you had spent years building. Whatever it was, it broke something. Not metaphorically, something in your understanding of how the world works. Something in your sense of what you could count on, cracked open in a way that could not be reversed. You know that the version of yourself that existed before it and the version that exists now are not the same person. Most people assume this is simply and entirely what loss costs. That damage is the only currency in which adversity is paid. What psychologists discovered is that this assumption, while understandable, is measurably and importantly incomplete. In the early 1990s, Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, began studying something the field of trauma had largely overlooked in its decades of research on suffering. Not the damage that adversity causes, which had been documented extensively, but what some people consistently reported in the months and years following significant loss or acute crisis. What they found, and what they would go on to name post-traumatic growth, was not what they had expected. It was not resilience in the conventional sense, meaning the ability to return to where you had been before the event. It was something structurally different. Some people did not return to their previous state at all. They moved beyond it. They reported emerging from experiences of profound loss with a deeper appreciation for the simple fact of being alive, with closer and more authentic relationships than they had maintained before, with a clearer sense of their own, rebuilt from what remains. This is distinct from the intrusive rumination that characterizes acute grief, the involuntary replay of loss that the mind imposes automatically. Deliberate rumination is the harder, more voluntary engagement with the meaning of what was lost and the meaning of what still remains present with them. Here is what the research then adds that changes the frame entirely. Tedeschi and Calhoun found that the degree to which a person experienced post-traumatic growth was not reliably predicted by the severity of the traumatic event. More severe events did not consistently produce more growth. What predicted growth was the degree to which the event disrupted the existing assumptive world, combined with the social and cognitive resources available to the person for reconstruction. A person whose world had been relatively unchallenged before the crisis, whose assumptions had never been seriously tested by prior adversity, was often more likely to experience significant growth because more of their internal architecture was available to be rebuilt in a different and more expansive form. Someone who had already had their assumptions disrupted and rebuilt once was sometimes less likely to experience the same magnitude of growth from later adversity, not because they were weaker or less capable, but because the reconstruction had already occurred in an earlier season of their life. This reframes one of the most confusing observations about how different people respond to hardship. The person who seems least prepared, who has lived most safely inside unchallenged assumptions, can sometimes emerge from loss with a more profound transformation than someone who has encountered difficulty many times before, because they had more internal structure to lose and therefore more space to rebuild in a fundamentally different direction. There is also a finding that directly challenges the popular cultural framing of resilience as the most admired response to adversity. Research by Tedeschi, Calhoun, and subsequent work by psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University suggested that rapid recovery to a prior baseline, the form of resilience most commonly praised, and post-traumatic growth tend to be outcomes that rarely coexist. People who recover most quickly from adversity rarely report meaningful post-traumatic growth afterward. People who struggle more significantly, who experience more prolonged distress, who take longer to find their footing again, are substantially more likely to report genuine growth in this aftermath. Not always, but measurably and consistently more often than those who bounce back fastest. The struggle is not a sign that something has gone wrong in the healing process. In many cases, the struggle is the healing process itself. What this means for anyone who has been through something that broke their previous understanding of themselves and the world is not a prescription for how to suffer or for how long. It is not a suggestion to resist recovery or to interpret pain as an indicator of imminent transformation. Most people who go through severe adversity do not experience post-traumatic growth, and the absence of growth is not evidence of failure or inadequacy. What it means is that the breaking is not only loss. Inside the destruction of what was, under conditions that include genuine support, deliberate engagement with meaning, and the willingness to rebuild rather than only return, something can emerge that could not have existed before the crack appeared. Not despite the crack, through it. If this opens something in how you understand your own difficult experiences, subscribe. Every week on this channel, we go deeper into the hidden systems shaping how you think, feel, and survive. The next video continues from exactly here.